There have been dozens of studies showing that lower total cholesterol leads to higher rates of cancer and stroke in humans. But there was also dozens of other studies in humans done before this study was conducted that showed that if you lower your total cholesterol using seed oils, then you have a higher risk of getting cancer and stroke. By the 1950s, many researchers believed that having high total cholesterol was the primary cause for heart disease. So they started advocating for diets that would lower total cholesterol levels. Now, this is where the story gets really wild. So as we progress throughout the 1900s, by the year 1961, there was a ton of pressure on the American Heart Association and other governmental agencies to address the growing heart disease epidemic. It was still a number one killer. Stroke was a number two killer closely behind. And at this point in 1961, Ancel Keys, he joined the American Heart Association Nutrition Committee, and he joined the NIH, the National Institute of Health panel, and he also appeared on the cover of Time magazine. Now, he was very prominent in pushing forward saturated fat is bad and to reduce your consumption of red meat and other animal products because it raised your total cholesterol. Now, here's where it gets a little messed up. So in this year, 1961, the AHA, the American Heart Association, released a formal statement that said, quote, "The best evidence available suggests that Americans could reduce their risk of heart attacks and strokes by cutting the saturated fat and cholesterol in their diets." And they also went on to say to replace saturated fat with polyunsaturated fats like corn and soybean oil. So for all of human history before the 1900s, virtually all the fats that humans had access to were animal fats like butter, lard, tallow, ghee, and then in some more subtropical climates, they had olive oil and coconut oil. They didn't really have access to industrially processed grain and seed oils like canola, corn, cottonseed, sunflower, soybean, safflower, grapeseed, peanut oils. They just didn't have access to these. There was a lot of science being done at this point in time. Keys had launched his 6-country study and 7-country study. The American Heart Association was conducting some science, but to be sure, they wanted to begin planning the biggest study ever tested on the diet heart hypothesis. So what they did was they developed the National Diet Heart Study. Now, this study was funded and it was led and conducted by many big food companies. How is this even legal? These companies included the vegetable oil giant at the time, Anderson, Clayton and Company, Carnation, the Corn Products Company, Frito-Lay, General Mills, Heinz, the Pacific Vegetable Oil Corporation, Pillsbury, Quaker Oats, and more. This study, the National Diet Heart Study, it ended up being a huge failure because a quarter of the men couldn't stick to the diet. They dropped out. They didn't want to follow the diet plan. So the study was never completed. They just didn't finish it. It was a huge waste of time, energy, resources, and money. So fast forward a decade. In the year 1971, Keys, the American Heart Association, and the NIH wanted to conduct 2 smaller studies in replace of this failed study that they had just tried to conduct. Well, what they decided to do was to invest $250 million into these 2 separate smaller studies. They thought this was going to be the nail in the coffin, that they were going to walk away from these studies showing that the diet heart hypothesis, the more saturated fat, the more cholesterol you eat, the more your risk of heart disease goes up. Well, wait until you see what the results of these studies were. The very first study they conducted was called the Mr. Fit Trial. This stands for Multiple Risk Factor Intervention Trial. This was conducted from 1973 to 1982. This ran for 9 years. This is the biggest and most demanding medical experiment ever performed, involving 28 different medical centers across the country, and it costed them $115 million to conduct. So what they did was they measured the cholesterol of 361,000 middle-aged men, and they found that 12,000 of them had cholesterol levels above 290 milligrams per deciliter. This is what your doctor would say is really high total cholesterol. Most of them were obese, they had high blood pressure, and they smoked. So they were prime candidates for having a heart attack or getting heart disease. The researchers gave them interventions to eat low fat, eat low cholesterol, drink skim milk, use margarine, limit eggs to less than 2 per week, and avoid meat and desserts. The other half of the men were told to eat and live however they liked. They were the control group. What the researchers found was staggering, that despite the intervention group, the group that had lowered their fat, lowered their cholesterol, despite them successfully changing their diets, they quit smoking, and they reduced their blood pressure, they died more than the control group who lived however they wanted. That is surprising. And then at the 16-year follow-up, this study was followed up again in 16 years in the year 1997. The treatment group, the group that had low fat, ate low cholesterol, they were found to have higher rates of lung cancer. Even though 21% of them had quit smoking, they lowered their total cholesterol, they lowered their blood pressure, they quit smoking, they improved their lifestyle, but yet at the 16-year follow-up, they had more cancer than the group who just lived however they wanted. Well, before this study, before the Mr. Fit trial, there have been dozens of studies showing that lower total cholesterol leads to higher rates of cancer and stroke in humans. They didn't want to know about these studies, or they just chose to ignore them. There was even a study done in rats. When rats were given corn oil, it doubled the rates of tumor. This was done in 1968, 5 years before the Mr. Fit trial was conducted. But there was also dozens of other studies in humans done before this study was conducted that showed that if you lower your total cholesterol using seed oils, then you have a higher risk of getting cancer and stroke. There was even a study conducted by NIH investigators, and it found that Japanese people with cholesterol levels below 180 milligrams a deciliter, that would be considered healthy by most health professionals today. Japanese people with cholesterol levels below 180 milligrams a deciliter suffered stroke at 2 to 3 times higher than those with higher cholesterol levels. Now, staying in this decade of the 1970s, the American Heart Association, NIH, Ancestral Keys, all these researchers are trying to conduct studies that would be the nail in the coffin to prove that the diet heart hypothesis is correct. Well, one of those studies that was conducted is the Minnesota Coronary Survey. This is the largest ever randomized controlled trial on the diet heart hypothesis. This isn't an association, this isn't observational, this is an intervention was given, and this one thing can prove if it caused an outcome or not. So what researchers did was they gathered 9,000 men and women in 6 different Minnesota state hospitals and 1 nursing home, and this study lasted for 4.5 years. 9,000 men and women in a randomized controlled trial is a lot. This doesn't happen in nutrition research. And it should be noted that this can't really be done today due to ethical reasons. So this is one of the best studies, if not the best study, showing if cholesterol saturated fat causes heart disease. Because they sourced their 9,000 men and women from hospitals and nursing homes, this was a very well documented and controlled study. They could control for virtually every factor that was going on in their lives. They knew exactly what foods they were getting, when they were getting it. And the researchers reported a 100% partition rate. Nobody dropped out of this study. What they did was they divided these 9,000 men and women into 2 separate groups. One group was fed traditional American food with at least 18% saturated fat and cholesterol in their diet. The other group got soft margarine, so seed oils, in place of their butter, whole egg substitute, low-fat beef, and dairy products filled with seed oils. You can pretty much think of Oatly with the canola oil in the plant-based milk. Here's the thing, both diets had the same amount of total fat in their diet. A certain percentage came from fat. But the intervention group had half the amount of saturated fat and limited their cholesterol. What the authors found when they concluded this 4.5-year randomized controlled trial was that there were absolutely no differences between the 2 groups for cardiovascular events, cardiovascular deaths, or total mortality. It didn't make a difference. But one thing that they noted was that cancer was a lot higher in the low-fat group. And maybe most interestingly and kind of sinister is that this study was completed in 1973, but it wasn't published until 16 years later in a relatively unknown medical journal where the authors knew nobody would find it. So they just hid it. They couldn't undo it. It didn't go the way they wanted, so they just hid the science.